Hello and welcome. This is Native American Heritage at Widener, a panel discussion. My name is Adam Mizell. I am research and instruction librarian at the Widener's Wolfgram Memorial Library, and I'll be moderating this panel today. Joining me are Donna Lee Mizuno, who is a PhD student in social work at Widener University. Her academic studies focuses on Native social welfare policies, tribal sovereignty, and federal Indian policy. And she's taught on these subjects at both the Masters of Social Work and continuing education levels, and guest lectures at the Native Studies program at West Virginia University. Donnelly holds an MPH from Westchester University of Pennsylvania and a BA in sociology from Lebanon Valley College. Thank you for being here, Donnelly.
Thank you for having me be part of this wonderful panel.
Next guest, I have the pleasure of introducing Daniel K. Richter, is Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania and the former director of the McNeil Center for Early American Studies. He's the author of Trade, Land, Power, The Struggle for Eastern North America, as well as other works, and is currently working on a book tentatively titled The Lords Proprietors, Land and Power in 17th Century America. Professor Richter comes here with the OAH, the Organization of American Historians. Thank you for being here, Professor Richter.
Real pleasure, thanks.
Next, I get to introduce my friend and colleague, Jennifer Padilla-Wise, who is an assistant professor of sociology here at Widener and co-coordinator of the African and African American Studies program here at Widener. She earned her PhD in sociology and Africana studies at Virginia Tech, and her areas of research include the sociology of knowledge and the sociology of race and racism. Welcome, Professor Wise.
Thank you.
Last but not least, Adam Depaul is a tribal council member of the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, where he also holds the positions of storykeeper and coordinator of the Rising Nation River Journey. He co-curates the Lenape Cultural Center in eastern Pennsylvania and the exhibit Existing Artistry, Enduring Presence, the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania at Temple University. Depaul is a PhD candidate and instructor at Temple with a primary research area in cultural and mythological studies. He is also the co-founder and president of the NAISAT, Native American and Indigenous Studies at Temple. Welcome, Mr. Depaul.
Thank you.
All right, let's get to the questions. First is for you, Donna Lee Mizuno. What would you like the audience to know about your work and your research?
Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you today. Let me give you a little bit of background of my research. For my study, I had conversations with 12 Native individuals to learn how their work contributed to reaffirming their sovereignty and preserving their culture. These 12 individuals were from various federally recognized tribes throughout the U.S. And when I say federally recognized, I mean a tribe that's had a government-to-government relationship. I termed these people Native Knowledge Keepers, and I derived the term from academic and non-academic sources. And I defined that term as using their Western knowledge combined with their traditional knowledge to reaffirm their nation's sovereignty and preserve their culture. And when I say Western knowledge, that encompasses more than just their formal education. That encompasses their knowledge that they've used to survive. For example, one of the people that I spoke with, I asked him how his nation avoided forced relocation. And he said that his ancestors had to be very strategic and very quickly formed a plan because they knew what happened to the tribes that were relocated. They were starving, they were dying. And they knew if they stayed on their land that they could hunt and fish and provide for their people. So, very quickly, they built churches, they cut their hair, they learned English. While in secret, they practiced their ceremonies and their customs, their rituals. I asked each one of them if they considered themselves to be a Native Knowledge Keeper. Once she laughed and she said, "I've been called many things, but never that." And then she said, "Yeah, I think I am." I asked another one if she was, and she said, "I don't think a Native Knowledge Keeper. I think a knowledge holder." I thought that was beautiful. So what I would like people to know from my study is I would like them to have a better understanding of tribal sovereignty. I would like them to understand that Native people have a unique political and legal status in the U.S., that this status doesn't stem from race or ethnicity, that the Native people have an inherent right and a political relationship with the federal government. For those in the academy, I would like them to know that Indigenous knowledge has its own worth and place in the academy as a valid method of research. And for my study, I used Indigenous methodology. Also, Indigenous ways of knowing and being are not diametrically opposed with Western ways of knowing and being. We can combine them for the benefit of all of us. And also, I'd like people to know that Indigenous knowledge can teach us different ways of understanding and engaging in the world. And really important, all of the people I spoke with left their reservations and went to college. And they all told me that they did this not for themselves, but for their community. And I would like to leave you with this quote from one couple. They're both husband and wife PhD psychologists that went back to work on the reservation. And he told me, we're both missionaries, not missionaries in a religious sense, but missionaries in a sense we wanted to bring the best of both worlds back to our communities and see what we could do. So that's what we did. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mizuno, for that succinct summary. This next question is for Dr. Richter. You have been researching and publishing in the field of Native American studies since the early 90s. During that time, how would you say the topic of Native American heritage has changed?
Oh, thanks again. Pleasure to be here, and pleasure to be waving the flag of the OAH as well as of early American history. Actually, I've been at it longer than that. My first book was published, yes, in the early 90s, but I went to graduate school in the mid-1970s, 1976 to be exact. Entirely coincidental that was the bicentennial of U.S. independence. But that was a long time ago, and I'm feeling more and more like an old geezer, maybe even an old white guy trying to say something about Native American history. But in those days, as far as a scholarly perspective on Native history existed, it hardly existed at all. I mean, it was not really a field. It was, if then largely white and still largely male historical profession thought about American Indian history, which was the term that was used at the time at all. It was seen as a subspecialty of Western history. Western meaning cowboys and Indians type history. Very little scholarly attention to Native peoples of the East. And to the extent that there was a developed formal scholarship, it focused on the policies of colonial and federal governments towards Indigenous people, and seldom really focused on the Native experiences themselves. And in a lot of ways, I think in terms of trying to understand what has changed over those dates, of course, an awful lot has changed in that, I came in at a time when actually there was, things were changing. When I came to graduate school, I had no idea about any of this stuff. In fact, I came to graduate school to study Puritans. And my first entry into this was by way of Puritan New Englanders and their interactions with Native peoples. But anyway, I knew nothing about this, and then started reading, and I came to graduate school about the same time that scholars such as Francis Jennings in particular were starting to really question the way that early American historians in particular had ignored and covered up, and in fact even repeated what the colonizers' mythology about Native people has told us ever since. And it was a very exciting time. It was what was known as the New Indian History. We were trying to uncover new sources. More importantly, read old sources in ways that brought Native voices out of those sources and let us think something about the experiences of Native people. And in particular, I think one of the things that a lot of us were trying to do back in those days was not only bring Native people to the forefront and place them at the center, particularly of the colonial experience, because after all, what is a colonial experience except one that Native people have experienced throughout the period since 1492, but also to really work powerfully against what was the kind of mythology, which was that Indigenous people really didn't have a history. In fact, there was even a book that was very influential at the time, written by an anthropologist challenging this notion, called Europe and the People Without History. Right? So I think the part of the effort there was to really not only make readers aware of the humanity and the importance of Native people's experiences to the broader history of this continent, but also to really try to uncover a sense of history. And by that I mean history and cultures that are in motion, that are constantly changing, and that weren't in some way just kind of sitting around waiting for Columbus to arrive to destroy their paradise on the one hand, or the flip side of that story is to bring them Christianity and civilization and bring them into the modern world on the other. Is to really kind of think about, what is Native history as history, not as a kind of static picture of people acted upon by Europeans, but as people whose histories were very much lived on their own terms and as part of the broader global and continental histories of which we're a part. So I think we made quite a bit of progress on that, particularly in the late 20th century. As an old guy, I'm getting used to thinking about that was back in that century, and now we're well into this one. And I think that, in a lot of ways, we did help to transform the way academics, at least, taught colonial or early American history. And at least people knew they were supposed to be talking about Native peoples as part of that experience, whether they had really deeply imbued themselves with those viewpoints or not. What has also, I think, particularly changed since the turn of the new millennium is the impact of the emerging discipline called Native American and Indigenous Studies on all of these fields, because and in some ways it's become a little bit of a conflict, I think, between kind of Western ways of thinking about time, thinking about written sources, thinking about the nature of historical evidence, and this very salutary emphasis on Native ways of knowing, Native ways of thinking about time, particularly taking Native traditions seriously as historical sources, right? Sometimes, though, that works against the idea sometimes that Native people actually have history, because there's a certain timeless quality that sometimes comes through with the ways in which people, particularly non-Native people, interact with the idea of knowing a Native way of thinking about the past, right? And here I think that one of the things that the ongoing dilemmas of those of us who have been studying these things for so many years is the continuing cultural gap and the continuing power of white settler colonial mythologies about the nature of Native people and Native history, right? And I think too often still today, when well-meaning white undergraduates, well-meaning non-Native undergraduates encounter efforts to understand Native experiences through a Native point of view, that Native point of view somehow gets turned into a kind of romanticized view of people who are, oddly enough, once again, people without history. And so I think in a lot of ways, one of our continuing dilemmas is to try to bring together, as Donna Lee was saying, Western ways of thinking about history and evidence and movement through time, and Native perspectives, and also to kind of try to break through the powerful mythologies around these things on all sides. So I want to just close by, since the question was how things changed since I started, one of the books that was very formative to me, and again, I had not encountered this book until I went to graduate school, but I think for a lot of people of my generation, and I hope even of this generation, remains kind of a touchstone on a lot of these issues, is a book by the great Vine Deloria Jr. with the title. It was 1969. The title was "Custer Died for Your Sins: An Indian Manifesto," in which it's one of the angriest books you'll ever read, but also one of the funniest books you'll ever read. It just really kind of particularly goes after anthropologists, it goes after white historians, and really tries to break through a lot of the mythologies. And he says at one point, "It is time to understand the ways of the white man." You can note how he's flipping the story here. The usual way of going about that would be understand the ways of the Indian. The white is after Indian lands and resources. He always has been and always will be. Again, he's caricaturing white people in the same way that white people have traditionally characterized Native people. But here's the real kicker for me, and the one that I think has remained a dilemma for all of us who are non-Native people trying to make sense of some of these issues. He says at one point, "There appears to be some secret osmosis about Indian people by which they can be magically and instantaneously communicate complete knowledge about themselves to interested whites. Anyone and everyone who knows an Indian who is interested immediately and thoroughly understands them." Right? And again, get the irony and the anger of that statement. And I think that for all of us, the ongoing challenge, whether we're natives or non-native peoples, is to try to break through that idea that all you have to do is hang around an Indian for 5 minutes and then you know something about her life.
So much, Dr. Richter. Next question is for Dr. Wise. You are helping to create diversity requirements in the general education curriculum here at Widener. Please talk a bit about how a sustained and critical exploration of diversity in coursework at Widener can help students to better engage with racial justice issues such as those facing Native American nations.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a part of the ANS Diversity Committee, and we are working on developing this diversity requirement, which has been going on longer than even my tenure. So we believe that by having this critical, sustained engagement with diversity, that students will be able to explore human cultural diversity. They'll be able to explore the social inequities that exist in society, race, gender, class, sexuality, so forth, as well as interacting with various viewpoints. And we do believe that the outcome of this requirement, if you will help students engage with racial justice issues by developing skills that will enable them to then think about and better understand experiences, particularly Indigenous history and experiences. Particularly the idea that this type of engagement could develop cultural competency. So having recognizing and respect for other cultures, empowering civic engagement, participation in the local global community, as well as empowering critical thinking skills. And so even though students, with this requirement would be required to take a diversity designated class, it doesn't necessarily mean that the course that they would take is going to emphasize Native history or Indigenous issues. But the development of these type of skills will allow for students to have a better understanding. But there's also a very real possibility that now that some of these classes would be required, that students could learn about, for example, the interaction between settler colonialism and white supremacy and how that together has shaped the reality of the United States as a white settler state and as a white settler colonial state. And the relationship that the U.S. has to Native nations, for example, and the experiences of Native peoples historically and contemporarily in the U.S. particularly.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. Next question is for Mr. Depaul. As story keeper for the Lenape Nation of Pennsylvania, what goals would you like to share that your nation has for itself, just in the medium and long term? And what kinds of alliances and accomplices does the nation hope to have among non-members towards those goals?
Well, again, thank you for having me here. It's wonderful to hear all these experts confirming so much of our cultural knowledge that we know is true. It's a wonderful thing. Some of the truths of our nation are really, they're involved in destroying misinformation. You know? And regarding us, specifically the Lenape, and specifically the Lenape who were not in the diaspora, who remained here through assimilation and hiding. Some very important truths. There are two different levels under which we have been erased. And one is just the fact that we're here. Very few people in the Lenape-Hoking out here in our indigenous homelands in the Northeast, very few people know that we're here or even know our name. There are, of course, historical reasons for that. But those who have heard of us, those who have heard the name, often think that the Lenape were an Oklahoma tribe or they're a Wisconsin tribe. They don't realize that we come from this area, eastern Pennsylvania, southern New York, New Jersey, northern Delaware, that this is our homelands. And then, if people are on the ball enough to know that much about us, people fall subject to the line that has been in so many history books, and you can still find in some high school, middle school history books, that says that all the Lenape left the Lenape-Hoking, and we were all moved out, all relocated. So there's three levels of mishistory, misinformation that we have to fight through. And really the one line that can get through all of them is to let people know that we are still here, and many of us never left. So that would be the main goal, to know about our nation. Now, as far as partnerships, along with what I just described, raising awareness of the fact that we are still here, and hand in hand with that is also raising awareness that not every Native American has a government-to-government relationship with the U.S. The government has recognized tribes that it has chosen to recognize, and chosen not to recognize those that it has chosen not to. And the government has standards. One particularly, which states that in order to be eligible for federal recognition, your nation has to have had a government-to-government relationship with the United States since the 1700s. Just that guideline alone excludes every Native American family, and every Native American nation in the country that had to go into hiding, that had to assimilate and get off the government radar in order to survive and not be moved from their land. Our wonderful relations in New Jersey, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, they have a ebook they put out called "We Are Still Here" to describe these plights in detail, and they call this last one the fallacy of federal recognition. So to know that we are still here, many of us never left, and that we are here whether or not the government says we are here, is hugely important. And aside from raising that awareness, one of our strongest initiatives is to be good stewards of the Lenape-Hoking, good stewards of the environment. It is essential to everything it means to be Lenape, to be a good steward and to have respect for the environment. It's in our creation story. It's in every cultural story we have during our yearly ceremonies. To participate in any way in your Lenape heritage is to care for the environment. And very briefly, one of our largest events that we hold every 4 years. It's the Rising Nation River Journey and the signing of the Treaty of Renewed Friendship. we paddle down the Delaware River, and it's about a 3-week trip, and all along the way, we sign a treaty with anyone who's interested, individuals, organizations. The treaty asks mainly 2 things. One, that they acknowledge the Lenape as the indigenous people of the Lenape-Hoking and spread that knowledge however they can. And 2, that they agree to be good stewards of their environment to whatever extent their capacity allows. We've been doing this since 2002, and through the years, we have maintained so many amazing partnerships. It has really been an inspiration to us how many people are curious about us and want to get involved and want to help spread awareness of the Lenape and steward their environment. Some of our treaty signers are people like the Audubon Society, the Friends of the Wissahickon, Lower Delaware Wild and Scenic, all kinds of watershed and environmental organizations, academic institutions, many colleges and departments within colleges, historical societies and museums. And those partnerships help give us a platform that we never had before to correct these misinformations. The universities that invite us in their classrooms to speak to their students, or like you invited me here today. The environmental organizations that bring us onto their boards and onto their councils, where we have a voice in what happens to the Delaware River, on whether or not this fracking project goes through or this construction project goes through. So I have to say, all of them, and on those 2 tiers, both in the academic and informational way and in the environmental way, community relationships have been a huge part of protecting our environment and correcting the mishistory about our people.
Thank you, Adam Depaul. We'll now go into a series of questions that are open to the entire panel, who answer as they would like. This first question is on the topic of land acknowledgement statements, which have become much more common, of course, across academic and other institutions. When are these helpful and when are they unhelpful?
Okay, I'll jump in. I do work with land acknowledgements for people who email our nation. And I think rather than when, the better word is how. How are they helpful and how are they not? Land acknowledgements are a wonderful sentiment. They are. You put a land acknowledgement in your email signature, on your company's documents. You say it at the beginning of every quarterly meeting. And that does raise awareness to people who aren't aware of Native issues. And one of the reasons land acknowledgements are helpful is because that is the situation of so many Natives. The problem is people don't even know about them. We have been that erased. Maybe when we get to the point where everybody knows all their Indigenous nations and their names and their histories, and we can focus more on action than just saying, hey, we're here, maybe there will be a little less use for it. But I think they are very helpful. Where they are particularly helpful is when land acknowledgements are a stepping stone into further involvement and engagement with a nation, with a people. That is where land acknowledgements shine. Where they can be problematic is when, and I think this is more a problem with an institution than the actual act of land recognition, but if some kind of institution has some kind of box to check, it's Native American History Month, we need to do something this month to recognize that, let's put a land acknowledgement statement, and then we don't have to think about this for another year. that can detract. It can give people a false sense of doing something meaningful, that they just wrote a sentence and now they don't have to do anymore. And of course, this should go without saying, but at the very bottom line, land acknowledgements are harmful if they themselves have misinformation or are not accurate. So people should consult with their local populations, indigenous populations, in constructing those statements.
Other responses from the panel? Hearing none, I'll move on to the next question.
Actually, I was going
Sure.
to respond. I think that, again, I think the land acknowledgements are a wonderful thing, but they're in danger of becoming this kind of rote statements, I think, in the way that Adam mentioned. But also, I think the way in which they're worded needs to be carefully considered, also in consultation with indigenous communities in any given locality. But there's a rhetorical trend sometimes to continue to place Native people in the past. We are occupying the territory of X, and then nothing that reinforces in the non-Native audience the idea that they're gone, we're here. And then I think the other thing is that sometimes there's a kind of some difficult language around words like giving thanks and Thanksgiving, right? Or what are we thanking Native people for? If that's part of an acknowledgement that settler colonialists are occupying their land. So I think that this all goes back, I think, to one of Adam's main points, is that people should be thinking these things through, not just running through them as a box to check off, and thinking about exactly what they're saying and what exactly the meaning of that phrase is, and what the people in that room are supposed to be doing with that statement.
And if I can just jump right back off that, thank you so much, Daniel, for mentioning that one of the most important problems is rooting us in the past, right? Is framing us as some kind of archaeological exhibit. So, there's lots of wording you should discuss with your local nations, but one blanket I can say is just to reaffirm what Daniel said. Don't just say we are on the land that this tribe once lived on. Make sure you have somewhere in that statement an acknowledgement that that tribe still exists and that they still live on that land if they do.
Thank you. Next question. On the topic of cultural appropriation, which calls back some of the answers we've heard so far, this can be a difficult subject to define. Where do you feel the line between respectful appreciation and appropriation lies, and who makes the decision as to where this line is, and how do we acknowledge them?
Well, one thing that I would say with regards to cultural appropriation is there's a very fine line between utilizing an aspect of a group's culture in a respectful and acknowledging way, than taking ownership of an aspect of a group's culture and then utilizing it, whether it be for profit or for whatever else. So that there's a fine line there. One thing we see in our culture, in U.S. American culture, is the appropriation of symbols and I'll just say symbols connected to Native cultures, and doing so in a very disrespectful way, which again diminishes the cultural vibrancy of different Native communities by kind of reinforcing a stereotypical image of an entire diverse group of people. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Professor Wise. Any other responses from the panel?
I mean, you could, again, talk on that for days. You know, there are so many different forms of misappropriation, from the well-meaning to the ill-meaning. Rather than take the rest of our time talking about all the ways that culture can be misappropriated, I'd just reinforce again that if there's anything that you are doing involving Native culture, whether it's adopting their dress or using a symbol or something like that, talk to the Indigenous Nation. Ask them, is this okay, or how can I do this in a good way?
Thank you, Adam. Okay, next question. Talk about the best ways that individuals can educate themselves on topics like systemic racism and the oppression of Native and Indigenous people.
I just sound like a broken record, so I'll just get it out of the way. Reach out to us. The best way to educate yourself is contact us. Many of our nations are happy to come into schools, give presentations to the community, or just chat. We can let you know what books to read and which ones are whitewashed or miss history. So I'll just leave it at that and pass that torch.
I think this also, yes, certainly reaching out to a variety of different people, but it's how do you educate yourself on anything? Stay away from anonymous internet sites, stay away from social media, read books by people with credentials, read widely, pay attention to what's going on in the federal courts in terms of all these issues. Pay attention to stories about, for instance, the incredible violence against Native women that is and the number of unaccounted for disappeared people in Native communities. Read critically, read widely, and really, again, try to think in terms of human stories and the way in which you would want to think about your own past as you're thinking about other people's pasts and their presence, right? But again, I think part of this is just one of the things that I think we all need to stress as we're dealing with young people and older people and all kinds of people is just the kinds of critical thinking skills that are so much not in evidence in so much of our cultural discourse today.
I'll echo what has already been said, but also just really as a sociologist, one of the ways that we think about, the social world and seeing the world is understanding how history shapes the present. And so I really would encourage folks to, read widely and read critically of U.S. history, not to place what's happening currently in terms of the past, but it provides the context. It helps us to understand what's going on in the present. And so, and one thing that kind of echoes what's already been said is that the U.S. educational system does not do a good job of teaching U.S. history critically, and it reinforces a the origin myth of the U.S. and, the idea of manifest destiny. And so it makes invisible the interaction between white supremacy and settler colonialism, which was the foundation of what we call the United States of America. I would encourage, looking into that critical history, again, just for context, for the reality of what's going on today.
Yeah, and I'd like to echo, the doctrine of discovery is not taught. I was in my second year of doctoral studies at Columbia before I learned about it. And I thought, how did I get to be a PhD student at Columbia and not know this? So whenever I lecture, whenever I go into classes, I always talk about that. I don't think any student should graduate from college without knowing the doctrine of discovery.
I just want to cap that off by saying, beware government websites with this area in specific, right? When we teach our students to use reliable sources, it's usually, hey, if it's .gov, you're good, you're set. But if you are researching Native Americans, governments will tell you that only certain of them exist, only the ones that they have recognized and have said existed. So make sure you go beyond those websites to find out about contemporary Native Americans.
Thank you. I understand the audience questions are coming in. So we have one final of our prepared question that I'm hoping all four of you could weigh in on. What gives you hope about the future of justice for Native American nations?
Well, I guess I'll go ahead and start us off then. One thing that has made me hopeful is the recent racial justice movements, and part of the reason that I'm hopeful is because of the emphasis on understanding history critically, which is also why I think there's this critical race theory backlash, but that's a whole nother thing going on. But folks reading about the history of this land and of the people and of what eventually becomes the United States government, and I really do believe that with more understanding of the history, it can develop more empathy, particularly for non-Native people and specifically for the dominant group, white people. And for example, we have Secretary Depaul, who is, the Secretary of the Interior currently, and she has created the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative to look into, that historical reality and, the traumas that continue to exist as a result of that history in the present day. And so it makes me hopeful, for example, to see that children who had passed at Carlisle have been repatriated to their families, to their homes, to their lands. Not all of them, but some, and just that gives me a little bit of hope.
I guess as the designated old guy in this panel, I just like to, you can easily despair. You can look at the backlash against critical race theory and all kinds of things that are so disturbing in our contemporary culture. But I would never have imagined in 1976 that the Washington football team would change its name, that the Cleveland Guardians would come to existence, that there'd be a kind of discourse around the World Series a few weeks ago, in which the Atlanta fans had to be put on the defensive for their offensive use of were placed in an offensive position, and had to go on the defensive to talk about why that was okay. Now that's back in our realm of cultural appropriation, but there is a kind of I think that the the culture is shifting. That's why there's been so much of a backlash against it. And I think that we can certainly hope that if we survive the next few years of our national politics, there's an awful lot of hopeful trends going on, and that we have to have hope that things are going to be better.
Yeah, I'll just say a second what both of you said. And Jennifer, you really hit a lot of the points that I would have hit. What I'll add to that is that we have seen it. We give a name to the time we're in right now. We have a story come down through our chief, Bob Redhawk, a story of 4 crows that we have used to tell the story of our history before colonialism, during the worst times and then during the hiding times. And now we say we are in the time of the 4th crow, which is the time that the crow flies in harmony with Creator again. And the reason we call this that time is because we have felt the effects of all these things. There has undeniably been a shift in the public consciousness, in the academic consciousness, which is so important because that's where the policymakers and the story writers, historians of tomorrow are being trained. And in some areas in the political arena, maybe not worth standing all years, but definitely this being invited here to speak. Excuse me, I'm being a bad student. We've seen the effect of this shift in consciousness, and it gives us hope.
Yeah, I think so. They're a young population. They're a growing population. I think social media has helped tremendously to get the word out. And, that's what my dissertation was titled, Changing the Narrative, Native Voices Matter. I wanted to portray a different socioeconomic scenario that is often portrayed for them because there are so many doing so many wonderful things. It's just amazing when you start to look and that you're, willing to look and to find out and to talk to them. They're happy. They want to they're happy to tell their lived experiences and to share things with you. And as Adam said, I hear it all the time. We're still here. And that's so important because, yes, they are. And they have so much to share with us and so much that we can learn, that we need to learn to save the planet.
Okay, I want to thank all of you for your contribution and your perspective today. This is, I understand we do have some questions from the crowd, and since I don't have access to those, I'll be surrendering the mic to Christina.
What you don't know is I've had control of it the whole time. I apologize for any laughter, but some of you are comedians, so there are a few chuckles on the live stream. I couldn't help myself. We do have a couple of questions from the chat. I do want to respect everyone's time, though, so I understand if you need to leave and have a heart out at 5 o'clock. We do thank you so much for being here. But very quickly, from Alan Jones, is there a mostly agreed upon plan on how to best move forward with a harmonious melding of Western and Native American cultures?
Wow, that's big.
It is, yeah. It's kind of an overarching question, I guess you could say.
And who would be in charge of that plan? I think.
We've already talked a little bit about community involvement and just making sure that you're reaching out to the right people and avoiding false sources. Are there good ways to actually put those into practice?
It sounds like those are the ways. Reach out to the populations and work with them to make sure you're not misappropriating anything, and reach out to them for education or for recommendations on resources.
Also, I think that, and I've heard this over and over, do the work. There's a lot of stuff that we can do ahead of time. We can't expect them to educate us. We have to go in with some knowledge. I mean, there's so many Native authors to read. There's events to go to. They talk about their books. The pandemic was horrible, but for me, it was wonderful in the sense that there were so many events that I would not have been able to afford to go to travel across the country that I could do by Zoom. I have learned so much from so many Native voices. So I think first and foremost is do the work. We have to do the work. You can't expect them to educate us. They'll be happy to answer your questions, but if you don't know a basic, you can't ask. I went to a workshop and I said to the Native woman, I said, okay, Marianne, educate us. And she laughed and she said, well, what do you want to know? So if I didn't have any background, if I hadn't done any work, I couldn't have asked. We couldn't have had a conversation. So first and foremost, do the work. Don't expect them to educate you on everything.
I'd also, my comment, my somewhat joking comment about who would decide on what that plan would be, I think does point to the fact that we're never going to agree on these issues. And if we think we are going to agree, then we're not really listening to people in the way that we're just talking about.
That can apply to so many situations. Yes. Listening is critical. Thank you for reinforcing that. All right, from Emanuela Sunday, we have, what are some of the major misconceptions that people in today's society have on Native American history and the existence of it?
Well, I can say this from my experiences in teaching race relations courses where we do talk about white supremacy and settler colonialism and therefore the history of the U.S. and all of that. I have a lot of, so some of the misconceptions that I've seen from students is the idea that Native people have been exterminated. And so this idea that Native people don't exist, right? And understanding that that there are and have been genocidal policies put forward by the U.S. government, recognizing that the existence, the survival and the mere existence of Native people today is actually resistance because of these genocidal policies. So that is a pretty big misconception. And then also students, manifest destiny is really, really ingrained in the educational system. And so students having to confront manifest destiny as opposed to settler colonialism and the realities of genocide.
There's a clash, Western society and academia in particular is biased towards the written word. And there are many Native American people who the majority of the history that they keep came through and continues to pass through the oral tradition. And that is not a slight against academia. I'm in academia. I know the importance of citing your sources. But when we work with Native histories, we have to check that to some extent, particularly like if you've been doing some of the amazing work you've been doing, Donna Lee, and doing some ethnographic research, you have to resist the impulse of gathering data and then saying, okay, this is what people told me, but this is what's on the page. So this is the authoritative thing. And this will rule over everything else. It's difficult to say that to students because then they ask, well, how do we get the history if we can't trust the documents? And I'm not saying don't trust the documents. There are wonderful people like the people in this room who have written very good books on the subject. But just be aware that